to say hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another Ask the Experts webinar, back in action once again. And it's actually definitely interesting to think about that. About a year ago, just about a year ago is when we first started our Ask the Experts series, and just to see how much we've grown from there. I know we went from weekly webinars, we've kind of gone down to some monthly ones and everything, but we are here to keep you informed. And that all being said, this one today is a big one, as there's been a lot of new updates and news surrounding the COVID-19 vaccines in recent weeks, and we're all here to address some of that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Vogt. I'm the Media Relations Specialist here at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center in Buffalo, New York. So let's talk about vaccines. I mean, while many people are jumping at the chance to go get one, others have been a little bit more hesitant because they're so new in the relative terms of drug development. They've created quite the buzz on the news and also on social media. And there's a lot of solid facts, but there's also a lot of misinformation that's being shared as well. And to shore some of that up and clear some of that up, we are here with Roswell Park's Director of Infection Control and Prevention, Dr. Catherine Mullen, to set the record straight and also answer some of those burning questions that have come up in your minds, and also that's all been floating out there in the stratosphere. So Dr. Mullen, quickly, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you just
tell us
a little bit about your role here?
So I am a infectious disease physician here at Roswell Park. So I see patients mostly in the hospital if they have infectious disease complications related to their cancer or their immune system being knocked down from their cancer or their medications that they're getting for their cancer. But I also am the head of infection control and prevention here. And so that has been a very busy role over the last year or so in the setting of the pandemic. So I'm happy to be here to answer any questions about vaccines. In terms of just a general overview, there are 3 major vaccines that have gotten EUA, which is an emergency authorization approval from the FDA. The Pfizer vaccine, the Mrna Vaccine, and then also the J&J or Janssen vaccine. And you probably can't escape the news of these vaccine approvals, indications, et cetera. But the 2 vaccines that were initially approved, the Pfizer and the Moderna, are both what is called mRNA vaccines, which are a relatively new mechanism for getting vaccinated, or basically getting your immune system to develop cells and protection against the virus. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses more sort of what we consider traditional vaccine technology. That is a 1-shot vaccine as opposed to the 2-shot vaccines that the Pfizer and the Moderna both require at this point. And again, those are based on, the initial studies and what was needed to provide efficacy. All 3 vaccines have been proven to be extremely effective, over 95% protective against severe disease and death. And that's really the most important thing, is that they're all going to protect the person who gets them really well from COVID. And in terms of getting any type of disease, the mRNA vaccines, which again are the 2-shot regimens, do have technically a little bit higher efficacy in terms of preventing all types of infections, as in a runny nose or very mild infection. But the J&J vaccine is still thought to be, 65 to 70% effective at getting rid of any type of COVID disease. But again, highly effective, over 95% protective against getting severe disease.
Thank you for some of that clarification on where we're at right now with a lot of these. So we do have a couple of pre-submitted questions that we're going to get to, but the floor is open for all of you to ask any lingering questions that may be on your mind. So please utilize the chat box or the question function down below. We'll be keeping an eye out for those. You can check the anonymous option if that's your thing, if you don't want your name to appear. So we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can during our time here this afternoon. But if your question's not answered, please don't hesitate to ask your physician, or you can also call 1-800-ROSWELL. So one of the big things that I think has been floating around lately, Dr. Mullen, is hearing that the vaccine may not be as effective for folks who are immunocompromised. Can you shed any light on that?
Sure. I think that this is a brand new virus. So we hadn't seen this virus prior to, at least in the US, prior to February of 2020. And in other areas of the world, the month or two prior to that. But so it's a totally new virus, and these are totally new vaccines. But we did know going into a vaccination process that certain patients are unable to mount a good response to any type of protective antibody-based response to any type of sort of pathogen or vaccine. So these are the same people who would have a very hard, difficult time mounting a response to the virus itself. And so when they get COVID, they have a very difficult time clearing it, because the process that your body uses to clear the virus is the same process that the vaccines use to sort of trick your immune system into thinking that, oh, they've built up this machinery and this protection against this virus. When they meet it again, you wouldn't get sick. But there are certain people, because of either their underlying condition, and cancer being, some types of cancer is one of them. And then some people, because of the drugs that they're on, which actually their cancer is related to sometimes abnormal production of certain antibodies. And so the treatment response is to decrease the immune system's ability to mount that response. So again, some of the medications can actually cause one to not be able to mount a response to the vaccine. And so it's not going to be as effective. That being said, we're still learning, your immune system has lots of different arms to it. And so we're still learning a lot about these vaccines, and the antibody response is really just a component of it. And so we're doing further studies, and there are studies ongoing at Roswell as well in our vaccinated patients, to look at particularly how, how much and how effective vaccines are in certain components of our population. As you guys all know, there are different types of cancers that affect people very differently, and their treatments affect people differently. So there pretty much are no two patients that are exactly alike. And so, we may have certain patients who we think, oh, we're a little bit worried that they're not going to respond as well to a vaccine, but we can't say 100% that they're not going to have any response. And so we also think that there's a really good chance that at least some of these patients, even if they are on a medication that depletes their immune response, that they still could have somewhat of a response to vaccines, and therefore that vaccination could still offer some benefit to these patients. So I would still say at this point that we very much recommend everyone to get vaccinated, that the benefits significantly outweigh any risks. Worst case scenario, the vaccine is not going to be as effective in you, but now that actually vaccination's been opened up more broadly to all adults, it is something to point out that really everyone in your close circle should also be vaccinated, because that really protects you from having any close interaction, those high risk exposures that you have in your household or elsewhere, protects you from the ability for this to creep in. So I would really urge everyone, family and friends, to please get vaccinated as soon as possible too, because even if you yourself won't have an optimal vaccine response, almost the vast majority of the population, these vaccines are extremely effective for, much more so than I think any of us initially thought was possible a year ago. These are some of the most effective vaccines sort of in the history of mankind. So that's a real accomplishment and something to celebrate. So it really is a tool to protect everyone, to have as many people vaccinated as possible.
So Dr. Mullen, you did mention that there are some studies going on here with different groups of cancer patients. There is a question that did come in. I mean, is there a way to test immune response to the vaccine?
So there are some antibody-based tests that you can test response to from an antibody perspective. So that's, again, one arm of the immune system. Most of us in infectious disease or immunology in general really think that the immune response to vaccines has multiple different components, so that using the antibody test alone is an insufficient marker of how protected you are, particularly with vaccines that are so effective, almost 100% effective. It's very good evidence that there's other components of the immune system that have protective mechanisms. And so, the concerns right now, the CDC actually very much recommends that antibody testing should not be done outside of clinical trials, because the value of that result right now is not known. So I think at the end of the day, we do know that certain subgroups are more at risk for not mounting an appropriate response for vaccination. They may need boosters, they may need special schedules. We don't know the answers to those questions right now, but this is why we're doing clinical trials in these patients, to get some of these answers. But right now, if you have a negative value for a test, that's relatively meaningless for me as a physician, because I don't know whether that means that you need more, or you're not protected, or there's no way to know that that test in of itself is valid for telling us the whole story of how protected you are. It may be that people who have negative antibody tests still have very good, certain people who have negative antibody tests still have very good efficacy against getting disease. Or maybe that most of the people who have negative antibody tests are significantly at risk for still getting even mild disease. So we're going to have to tease those out, but using sort of broad-based clinical trials to give more evidence right now. So thus, right now, it's not recommended that we antibody test broadly because the test result is not helpful.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now there's a bunch of questions coming up, a series of questions just related to J&J. So we'll knock those out, and then we'll get back to some of the other, sort of general questions that we're seeing surrounding all three. So,
Sure.
And I know just for everyone else to note, Dr. Mullen did a fantastic radio interview recently on WBEN regarding the J&J vaccine when it was noted that it was getting temporarily pulled due to some reviews and everything. So I advise people to check that out if they're able to. I know it's on their website. So we'll knock it out with the first one. For people who have already gotten the J&J vaccine, I mean, is there any worry or concern that should be there, or any warning signs that people maybe should look out for this very rare blood clot disorder?
Sure. So, I mean, the vaccine has been paused now for a while. So there should have been, again, they're reviewing all the data. So there shouldn't be anyone who's gotten it super recently. The time course that these clots are seen is pretty much in the 1 to 2 week range. So there shouldn't even really be that many people out there that are still in that range where even they could have this potentially rare concern. So I wanted to minimize concerns on that front. Really that these, the concern is that there were 6 cases of a certain kind of blood clot that caused the FDA to pause. They didn't halt, they didn't put any warnings on or anything, but they basically just said, listen, we need more time to review these special cases. There have been almost 7 million J&J vaccines that have been dosed in the United States. So 6 out of almost 7 million is extremely, extremely low risk. That being said, this really shows, I think, the robust nature of our safety process, particularly for vaccines that are under the emergency authorization protocol. So I think this basically shows that our system for safety monitoring is working, but we're going to need to get some more details about other links that those patients may have had. We know that in general, the patients, and they've seen some similar reports with the Astrogenic vaccine, very, very rarely, that is being utilized in Europe. That's not something that's approved here. And it's not approved here just mostly because of distribution issues. Those were European-based vaccines that got approved early, and the US had really put their time, money, and effort into these other vaccines, and we have enough of those other vaccines to vaccinate our population. But that's really the approval process. It's not approved here because of safety issues. So I just wanted to clarify that. But there is this rare type of blood clot occurs in the brain, and obviously is something that we want to make sure there aren't certain subgroups of people who are at higher risk than 6 in 7 million for. Again, the risk of getting blood clots related to COVID in general is much, much higher. So something like 150,000 people in a million people who have COVID in general will get blood clotting and clotting disorders. And there are a lot of other drugs and other things that can predispose you to clots. But again, I think having some clarity on which groups maybe we should monitor more carefully for would be helpful, and is the reason for the pause. In terms of things to look out for, blood clots in general, obviously, if you're having any changes in sensation, strength, vision, anything like that, you should notify your doctor. Those are sort of bread and butter things that I would say as general recommendations, regardless of whether you've gotten a vaccine recently. You should also, obviously, a lot of people are getting vaccinated through general vaccination first. If you have any health concerns, you should definitely make sure your physician knows that you were vaccinated within the last 2 weeks or something like that. It may be completely unrelated, but it's something that if you weren't vaccinated at your physician's office, should be just put a puzzle piece to put in the whole big picture of the puzzle to be potentially incorporated. That's how these reports happen, is when physicians have things brought to them and they say, oh, this person got a vaccine recently. That's how things get reported to to the FDA in general. So that's a really important process. So just transparency with your vaccination schedule. And also if you have any abnormal symptoms, to contact your doctor. Typically more traditional blood clots, you think of sudden onset shortness of breath, for which you should call 911. If you have swelling or pain in usually one leg or arm, sometimes that can be related to blood clots in your extremities, which is probably the most common cause of blood clots. But again, if you have any concerns of acute or new symptoms that seem strange to you, I would say in general, after you tried new drugs or had a vaccine, anything like that, you should be touching base with your doctor to know if it's something that needs more workup or that's something that you should be concerned about.
Excellent. So two things I'm going to kind of combine together is, will J&J, once all the, sort of reviews are done, do you expect it to be put back on the market and then, or, the unpause to happen essentially?
Mhm.
And I know you touched upon this briefly. I mean, is there a chance that, once they look at it, that maybe they'll say like, oh, this is better suited for, this age range or, this group of people, should women be getting a different dosage of the vaccine than say men?
Sure. And that's what the FDA and the NIH will be looking into specifically is that those are all valid questions. And should there be subgroups that we should approach more cautiously or do additional monitoring in? Again, it doesn't take away from the overall value of the drug and the need for us to have sort of mass universal vaccination to cut the risk of transmission of COVID generally. And again, particularly there are some people that vaccines are not going to be as effective for. Again, that's a minority of people, but we need to keep that in mind that even if everyone got vaccinated, there will be little pockets of people that are more susceptible to disease, which is why it's really incumbent upon us as immunocompetent adults, and then hopefully young adults will be able to be eligible, and teenagers will be eligible to be vaccinated as well soon. But that's why it's really important for those of us who do have robust immune systems to get vaccinated, because that means that we can't transmit it and we cut the chain of transmission.
So a few more things as we wrap out, the information regarding J&J. So was J&J was it researched as much as Pfizer and Moderna?
Yes. Yep. There's a standardized process that all vaccine trials have to go through. They have to meet certain bars for efficacy and safety. And part of that is a timing issue. And so that's why actually initially, when we projected when we potentially have vaccines available, the projections were probably early January. But because there was so many more cases last summer of people who ended up getting COVID or having risk factors for getting COVID, the trials actually enrolled much faster than were projected. So then the time period for monitoring and also immunologic monitoring with labs and whatnot, that shortened a little bit. But all of the trials had to go through the same time. They go through early trials, which they use animal models for. And then there's a progression of trials. The last phase of the trials is safety and efficacy trials. And all three vaccines pass very robust safety and efficacy trials. And so the process is not different. You can see that's one of the reasons why J&J actually, was approved later, because it had to meet that same criteria as the other vaccines and it started enrolling later. But also too, the J&J trial included data on people who had variants of COVID as well. And so that's because it started later, so it captured some more of those patients. We really think that at this point that the vaccines are very effective against any circulating variants. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. But the J&J trial in of itself was held at a different sort of time period than the initial mRNA trials were held.
So that kind of leads me into, there's some questions surrounding the Astrogenic vaccine, which we're seeing roll out in Canada, Europe, etc. And people developed some similar issues. So why was that vaccine not pulled from, say, the UK or not paused in Canada?
Sure. So the overall, again, they did see a very small amount of cases. We're talking literally a few per million. in patients. And the overall thought is that the risk of COVID is very much for any person, even a younger person who's not at as high risk of having severe disease where they get intubated in the ICU of a hospital or potentially die from COVID, but that the risk of even having that rare severe case of COVID is much higher than any potential risk from the vaccine itself. So, that is the reason why, and the thing is the AstraZeneca vaccine, again, uses sort of more traditional vaccine technology using what we say it's a non-replicable adenovirus. So basically a virus that is able to give your body information to produce antibodies against the COVID virus, but that virus itself cannot go on and replicate in your body and cause any sort of viral infection in of itself. So the AstraZeneca vaccine is similar in the background to the J&J vaccine. Again, they are utilized in different areas just because of a distribution model and what essentially was bought by certain countries. So we didn't buy any of the AstraZeneca vaccine because we had put our resources into the other vaccines that we had available. But again, that's why overall, once it was reviewed, the EU and other oversight agencies that have similar processes to our FDA basically said it's much more important, it's much less risk to get this vaccine than it is to get COVID for any person. And so that's very strong. That's a very strong argument for keeping it in circulation. But again, we'll have to see if the FDA tends to be actually a little bit more conservative about approvals than a lot of the other authorizing bodies worldwide. And so maybe that the FDA does come out with specific recommendations for use for the J&J vaccine that was not even delineated by the similar bodies in the European Union or the UK.
Gotcha. All right. We'll jump off J&J for a little bit. A couple other things that kind of been circulating. So can we be sure that there won't be any other side effects that pop up down the road after getting the vaccine? And I would think that this applies to all of the 3 that are available right now.
Sure. We don't think so. I mean, again, we would have heard, so now people in the trials, some of them are almost a year out from, being almost a year out, maybe 10, 11 months out from getting the first doses of the vaccines that are now approved. And, if we had been seeing a signal, like if we had been seeing that there were sort of more, short, long-term effects, we would already be hearing about them because those people in the trials are still being monitored for more long-term effects. So I do not think that there are any updates, from a month's perspective, because again, the public would have been, there's a very strong push. We really want to be transparent with patients if there are any risks. Just like there are risks to, taking any medications, you want to be upfront with patients saying, listen, you need this medication, but I do need you to look out for these certain things. If that was the case, we would really want to make sure we educate patients about that, but that does not appear to be the case. That being said, I think it's important to say that, none of us are sort of omniscient. We're not a deity that can say, oh, in 10 years, this is going to pop up. So, we don't have data from 10 years. And so it's impossible to say that nothing, that we don't think from a scientific perspective, there's no theoretical risks that we have hypothesized, or else again, we would have shared those. But there's no way to 100% say that there's nothing, crazy that could happen. But I think the risk is very, very low. And again, is a much more theoretical risk than the very real risk of getting COVID and potentially dying from COVID, or passing COVID to someone else who can potentially die from COVID. Absolutely. I think I wanted to add, and I think one of the things that's been very interesting working throughout this, the COVID pandemic, is that a lot of the people who is dealing with sort of survivor's trauma from people who feel like they infected a vulnerable family member or a vulnerable friend. And that is really going to be, that's a devastating thing to deal with. And we, from a perspective of if you're young and healthy, your risk of dying from COVID is not super high, but your risk of passing it to someone who could get really sick from it is much higher. And that comes with it, big psychological potential effects that go beyond any physical effects of the virus itself.
Yep. Absolutely. One of the other buzzwords that have been going around recently is the B word, the booster. We had Pfizer coming out recently saying that their vaccine is going to require a booster. How many are we going to think it will be necessary? Should we assume that Moderna is going to need one soon or as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, these were all sort of like conjectures. So again, there's been no formal recommendations. We're going to have to look at the data when it comes up. If there is need for boosters, that those will be issued. It may be that people do need a booster. It may be that someone needs. So, for example, there are some vaccines in series that we give one, in 1 year intervals. It may be that you need only 3 of Pfizer and then you're good for life. I cannot tell you the answer to that question. It may be that you need it more often. It also really depends as, is this going to be something that we're able to mostly eradicate with vaccines where people will not need repetitive boosters? Or is this something where if we do not achieve enough sort of universal vaccination, and this is still a circulating risk, then the average person would potentially need to get vaccinated or boosted theoretically more often if this becomes more of a chronic risk as opposed to a short-term risk. My hope is that we are able to achieve much more viral eradication over the next several months, so that looking at like many years types of boosters is hopefully not something we're going to need. But all of these things remain on the table as we sort of see where the trajectory of the pandemic goes. And again, we should always remember like our situation in the US, and I don't think this has been talked about enough, but we've had a tremendous success in vaccine operational, getting vaccine to people, to patients. In Western New York, over 40% of people have gotten at least one vaccine, which is really incredible when you think about it. And so that is something that's really not available in other countries. And there's been a lot of talk about dysfunction and negative things related to the pandemic. And I just wanted to highlight that the operation to get these vaccines and then get these vaccines to people has really involved so many different parts and so much collaboration, and is really generally a success story. Obviously, there are things that can always go better, but even if we look at our neighbors to the north in Canada, where vaccine rollout's been very, very difficult, we're really in sort of a privileged situation that our vaccine availability is what it is in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone here in Western New York who's tuning in, who live in the immediate area, I know it was even talked about yesterday on Tuesday during one of the county's press conferences that said that like we are almost nearing the walk-in stage where there's clinics open. I mean, they do say, at least in Erie County, just for anyone who lives here, that they'll be announcing when things are in walk-in status. So still try to make an appointment and everything, but it is pretty incredible that we have, gotten to this point when we thought maybe 2 months ago, I don't know how am I going to have an appointment 3 months out, 4 months out and waiting? So now people can kind of, switch it up and just go in and get it. So it's pretty incredible with that operational rollout that you're talking about, Dr. Mullen.
Right. I mean, just again, for comparison, in Canada, they've pushed back second doses, which is not study sort of by the book per the clinical trials and the known efficacy of the vaccine. They've pushed back second doses by several months in order just to get the initial doses they had out to citizens. So, it is, I would, again, just urge people to get vaccinated as soon as possible there. And we should think of this, it's been a really difficult time for everyone. But in terms of coming up with solutions and getting solutions to the population, I think this has really been a success story that we should highlight.
Yep, absolutely. One other question about boosters, and this kind of gets into the science weeds of things, but if the genetic profile of the spike protein mutates, will it be a booster shot that we need to get, or will it be a completely different vaccine?
So early data that we have shows that any even changes to the spike protein, the vaccine should work against, because it's looking at multiple parts of the spike protein. So this should still be effective. And again, that's why we don't think that there are currently any variants right now that are sort of vaccine proof variants. So is there a possible genetic way that a virus can mutate to come up with the perfect sequence to get around a vaccine? That's always a possibility. I would say that's a very, very small possibility. It's not something I'm currently worried about.
And now I think we have just a series of generic questions to sort of round us out today. And you did mention this a little bit about, Canada pushing back their second dose regimen. But say, someone who's here, I missed my appointment for my second dose, had to get it a couple weeks later. Am I still good? Am I still going to be, have the same protection as everyone else who, fit the 21 or 28 days?
Yeah, we think so. And that's why we really urge people to get, even if for some reason they have a reason why they couldn't get vaccinated. Sorry, I had to frog my throat. They couldn't get vaccinated in that specific time period for the booster. We still obviously recommend the booster, and you should get boosted as soon as possible. So we think that's fine, but we have no data that can, the reason to stick with vaccine schedules is that we know that the data of efficacy should match the general data. And so while, again, from a scientific perspective, there shouldn't be really any difference by having a booster 2 weeks later, and your immune system should mount the same response, that your time course can't be perfectly matched to when the study participants initially got the boosters. So again, would definitely urge you to get boosters whenever you can, as soon as you can to the initial timeline. But that's not a situation that we'll have a specific parallel study for in terms of efficacy.
Here's an interesting one that came through. Is it harmful to drink alcohol after getting the vaccine? I mean, it's an exciting time. I'm sure some people after they finish their first or second, vaccine dose, they want to kind of celebrate. I mean, it's a big moment. Maybe pop have a glass of champagne, that sort of thing. But what do you recommend in terms of alcohol intake?
Well, I do think, obviously, I had mentioned that I think that the vaccines are a real accomplishment. And after many of us living sort of more cloistered lives over the last year, I think the vaccine is your ticket to leading a little bit more normal life. And so that should be something to celebrate. I don't think there's any problem with having a glass of champagne. If you wake up with a headache the next day, you're not going to be able to tell whether it's from the champagne or whether it's from a vaccine headache. But, I don't think it's going to make you miss any, horrible potential adverse reaction. So I will say, just of note, since you mentioned it, I would not recommend, once you get the vaccine, it's not like you got a bulletproof vest on and when you leave the vaccine, the administration center. So it does take a couple of weeks for the vaccine to work. So even for the second, to have the complete efficacy, we think that closer to 95, 96% protection against COVID, you really do need a couple of weeks after your booster to meet that bar of protection. So I would urge people to if you've been itching to go to a bar after you get your vaccine, just hold off for a couple of weeks after your booster, and then you can go and have your glass of champagne at that bar. But I would prefer, it would be much safer. Your safety profile does not automatically change immediately after you get that vaccine.
Safely pop a bottle at home then.
Yeah. Just wanted to clarify, I wouldn't go out and celebrate that night.
Exactly. There was a question that popped in earlier in the chat, and it related to COVID arm, which I guess is the red rash-like skin infection that could happen right around the injection site. I mean, if someone gets that, does that mean that they have a good response to the vaccine?
We don't think that any of these this adverse reaction profile, whether it be an injection site issue, which can happen with pretty much any vaccine, it is related to how effective the vaccine is. So, again, we're always learning more about that. All these things are still under review. And so, but this has come up a lot with this question of, if you have, a 12-hour flu-like syndrome after getting a vaccine, does that mean that your immune system has taken up the vaccine more than not? We don't think right now that there's any relationship to side effects and efficacy.
Another question that had popped in is, does the use of monoclonal antibody drugs or steroids reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine?
Well, monoclonal antibodies is a super broad topic. And so there may be some that do. Steroids can reduce, high-dose steroids and prolonged high-dose steroids can theoretically reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine. But again, I mentioned this earlier in the webinar, but that would not preclude someone from getting the vaccine at this point. So even though if you've been on high-dose steroids for a number of potential diagnoses for which we use high-dose steroids, Is there a chance that you will have potential less robust response to the vaccine than someone who's on no steroids? Yes, but the amount of that lessness, if that makes sense, the amount of that efficacy change, we don't know for sure. And I would still say that there's a huge benefit in you getting the vaccine.
Two questions that have popped up about kids. Any idea when you may expect the vaccine to be available to those under the age of 16?
So I actually expect kind of soonish that the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, and then I'm sure Moderna will be closely following suit, for 12 to 15-year-olds will be approved. In terms of the risk profile, 10 and older are really the children that we can see spread disease more effectively and also can get sick, even though they're very unlikely to get severely sick. And I do want to reiterate that children really they have a much higher risk of getting severely ill from most of our sort of common respiratory viruses. But in terms of, it will be a boon, I think, once we were able to vaccinate kids who are 10 and up, who we know have a higher likelihood of transmission and can get theoretically sicker than very small children who really in general do not get sick at all. So 12 to 15, I would anticipate kind of soonish. And then there are studies going on in like 5 to 12-year-olds and whatnot that are enrolling. And so I think that we will see those come out in the next several months. I do not anticipate that this vaccines will be approved for kids under the age of 10 before the start of the next academic year. So I just wanted to make that very clear. And so I don't think it should be in any way used as a bar for kids and their eligibility to go back to school. And again, these are the portion of our population who is not going to get really sick and also does not pose as much of a public health risk from a transmission perspective.
So in this sort of, interim time while we wait and see what's coming next with kids and vaccination status, is there anything that can be done to best protect them, avoiding travel, et cetera, et cetera? What are your recommendations for parents?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about kids, we should talk about them from a global standpoint and realize that risk is not just related to COVID. So I realize that this is a conversation about vaccines and COVID, but I think, I'm a mom of 4 kids, and I think that there are public health concerns that go beyond COVID itself. And we just discussed that COVID itself, while there is a minority of kids who can get severely ill, that's a super, super, super minority. So much, much less, for example, than influenza, which is something that we acknowledge in our society is a risk every single year. So, and we still, let them go to playgrounds and go on a train and things like that. So we should, I do think it's important to sort of regroup at this point where we can really protect adults, and adults really should have the responsibility to get vaccinated and protect kids who are not eligible for vaccination, so that they don't even have the even super, super minute risk of being that small fraction of children who get sick. I would say at this point, children have really suffered very unduly the effects of isolation in the pandemic. And we're seeing in children a lot of physical and mental health effects of them not having normal socialization and interaction with people. And so again, I think if the focus for now, again, based on what we know and what data is readily available to us, the focus should really be on making sure that as many adults and then young adults, so if we can get that, even when it gets approved for 12-year-olds and up, as many of them as possible, so that we can start to live a modicum of normal life, which will allow kids to have the physical activity and the social interaction that they need. But really a risk benefit should be, it's important for kids to be able to take a family vacation, right? And so we should keep the idea that those small kids are at really minimal risk for disease and transmitting disease in the back of our minds, while we're waiting all this other data for can we eventually vaccinate them.
Do you think that there's going to be any other additional vaccines potentially that could come to the market here in the US?
I don't think so. We currently have enough vaccine acquired that we've essentially, it's either been produced or we've bought that's in production to vaccinate hundreds of millions of people more than are currently approved for. I don't see the need right now that given what's on the market. and our ability to vaccinate, the American population, that we would acquire different types of vaccine. I think there's also a benefit in standardizing it a little bit with the 3 ones that we have, which are very good and they offer different benefits. It's helpful even for these things to know these sort of super, super rare side effects. You would have never seen, for example, the blood clots that's again 6 and almost 7 million administrations. You would have never picked that up in a general trial because you would have needed it's so rare that you need so many cases to be able to even pick up that very, very small signal. So there is benefit to the public in making sure that we have very effective vaccines, which we do. And then we also standardize it as much as possible so that we can take all that aggregate evidence and be as, transparent and risk averse as we can be.
1 or 2 more, and then I think we're going to wrap up. But one thing that, valid to ask, if the vaccine is working and we are seeing, a good percentage of the Erie County population, get the shot in the arm, why do you think we're seeing a surge of cases right now in our county?
So if you look at the cases and the case breakdown, you're seeing younger people who are getting infected. And to me, that's exactly what I would have expected. So just imagine you've knocked out 30, almost 40% of the population for being eligible for getting COVID, right? And then we're talking about knocking out the percentage of the population who is older. So effectively, if you imagine all of the current cases and then all of the potential cases that would have happened in that age population had they not been vaccinated, you can imagine that the surge would theoretically be much, much higher than it currently is because we see a vaccine effect. I am extremely concerned about the number of circulating cases, and we are seeing it in unvaccinated people. So again, all the more reason to get vaccinated and really urge your friends and family to get vaccinated. I think I've talked about this before in webinars, but we talk about cocoon effect of protecting vulnerable people. And so we really need to use that to urge the general public to make sure that that 40% goes well beyond 40%. But that's why you're seeing the shift downwards, is because theoretically, without vaccines, the surge would be significantly higher than it currently is. I would ideally like to see many fewer cases. We are still seeing a diagnosis of COVID, and I really, would hope that we can sort of hang in there a little bit longer and again avoid high risk exposure. Encourage people to get vaccinated. Encourage, you can have more, you can eat meals with people who are vaccinated, have more normal interactions with people who are vaccinated. So I think again, using that protection as a ticket for normalcy really should be something that we urge, because I would like to see us reverse the trend of the surge, but the surge is all related to unvaccinated persons. And that's why you've seen the shift in demographics.
Okay. I think one last thing to really wrap things up, Dr. Mullen, if there's anything you could just add on just, general good behavior, if they're, good hygiene, that sort of thing. And then, because I know we actually talked about before we went live a little bit about the cleaning and that sort of thing. Just want to wrap everything up with a nice bow. That'd be great.
Oh, great. Okay. So yeah, one of the things that came up and I was saying, earlier is that the CDC came out this week very stridently saying, and it's something that I, think we need to continue to message because there's still a lot of confusion over this point, but this virus is not spread by contact surfaces. So, I walk into businesses and I see them, doing this extensive wipe down after every customer or different places. And I know there are operational hurdles for running businesses and schools and camps and things like this because of all of the, necessary, or the thought to be necessary sort of hygiene protocols, but that is not necessary for COVID prevention. So COVID is spread person to person from a respiratory standpoint, not contact surfaces. So there are many respiratory viruses that you can pick up from contact surfaces. And so that's why it's much more likely, if you've had no high risk exposures, you could still come down with viruses that give you a cold, because from touching something and then you go to eat a sandwich, those viral particles can get into your mouth. So but you're not going to get COVID that way. It's very, very, very unlikely. And so, this is data, again, this was a new virus at the beginning in 2020. I couldn't say this. I couldn't say, I don't know, I know it's not spread by contact surfaces, but at this point we really do know that. And I think we need to focus on continuing to do things that we know minimize risk, vaccines being the biggest push, but also, things like universal masking and things like that. While there's still a significant portion of the population that's unvaccinated will have to continue. But we should also make sure that some of the stuff that has been operationally and psychologically exhausting for people that doesn't work, we should stop doing. So you don't need to wipe down your groceries, every day. If you want to do that, you should be doing it for some other non-COVID related reason, but don't do it due to concern for COVID.
Thank you for tying that all together. And we are actually just right about the end of all of this. So, I mean, Dr. Mullen, thank you again, as always, for taking time out of your schedule to address all of this. This was a big one, especially as, all that news about J&J came out. A lot of helpful information to sum it all up. And for anyone whose questions were not answered, again, we encourage you to reach out to your primary clinic, your care team, give 1-800-ROSWELL a call too. But if anyone, any of your friends and family have not or did not have a chance to tune in live, the video from today is going to be available to view on demand. And then a link is also going to be sent to the email that you signed up with. So please, again, share this with all of this updated information. We just want to get it out to as many people as possible, assuage fears, and continue to encourage people to get vaccinated as soon as they can. Now, for more information about coronavirus or the COVID-19 vaccines, please feel free to visit our website, roswellpark.org/coronavirus/vaccine. As we wrap up everything, we want to thank all of you for tuning in again, but again, be sure to share this with people who may not be able to have the chance to watch right now. We hope that we have been able to answer all of your questions and, of course, ease some of your concerns or worries that you may be having at this time. We at Roswell Park, we continue to be here for you, and we will all continue to stay strong together. Be safe, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Thanks. Bye.